The 2025 International Colloquium Series Europe is sponsored by Union Theological Seminary in the City of New York, the Episcopal Diocese of California, King's College London, Regent's Park College, University of Oxford, the Center for Black Theology at Regent's Park College, Oxford, the Protestant Theological Institute of Paris, and in partnership with the Cathedral Church of the Holy Trinity, the American Cathedral in Paris.
The Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation is dedicated to promoting justice, health, education, and service. Please consider making a donation at NorcalMLKFoundation.org. Every donation makes a difference.
Thank you, Anthony, for all you Americans. We say Anthony, so some of us in our delegation still say Anthony, but we don't call her name. It's so much a pleasure to be here. I guess, has it been 21 years? How long has it been? It's been a while. Yeah. So it's just great to come back and to see the immense development of both. Anthony is the leading Black liberation theologian globally, that's my humble opinion, as well as him being here the first at Oxford, which is one of the most prestigious universities in the world, with the Black Theology Center. So we're just very humbled by being in his presence, all the work he's done. He's been on the path and remains on the path. And to other friends and colleagues who made the journey with us, good to see him again here. And others we hope to be along the way. I was asked to just give some fundamental aspects of Black theology as part of my sharing, so that was my task, and that's what I've done. In the 1960s in the United States of America, the majority of Black and white people were segregated, either legal segregation or de facto segregation. The main person working against this racial divide was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the Civil Rights Movement. King's solution was racial integration. He believed that the love of God had been planted deep within the souls of both Black and white communities, and through living together, the love in each other would grow as love for each other. This theological claim flowed from his initial statement in what he called the beloved community. In this theology, Black and white Americans should live, work, and play together. In fact, both races could intermarry because love was between one man and one woman. And as King argued, we judge people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Initially, Black teenagers and college students followed King, and consequently, they created their own organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, acronym is SNCC. We can see that they were followers of King's nonviolent integration philosophy. That's why they put the word nonviolent in the name of their organization. Now, after a couple of years of organizing Black families in the state of Mississippi, 1962 to 1964, and 1964 to 1966, these youth became impatient with King's philosophy because they felt ordinary Black workers and rural peasants were not benefiting from any of King's integration campaigns. This shift to a more militant strategy was shown when Stokely Carmichael was elected chairman of SNCC. During June of 1966, there was a civil rights march co-led by Dr. Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael. And it was during this march that Carmichael interrupted the whole process by introducing a new slogan that directly challenged King and the entire civil rights movement. On that June 16, 1966 day, Carmichael shouted, "Black Power." From then on, young people moved out of the civil rights movement and created a new phase called the Black Power movement. A A month later, July 31st, 1966, a group of 48 black church pastors, 47 men and one woman, Anna Hedgeman, gave a Christian theological interpretation of this new slogan called Black Power. On that day, July 31st, 1966, a Sunday, they published a full-page statement in the New York Times newspaper. Rather than condemn Black Power, they supported it. They claimed that biblically and theologically, Christianity in the United States connected power and race together. This was the core gift that these pastors presented to the practitioners of Christianity, to the professors of the academy, and to the general American public. Black Americans, the pastors argued, are just like any other minority population in the United States. They needed to use power for their black race. But beyond a sociological analysis, these pastors brought to bear the theological and biblical interpretations. So from July of 1966 to the beginning of 1969, these church pastors were slowly working on a black theology of liberation. But it wasn't until March of 1969 when James Hal Cone wrote the first book on liberation theology that church pastors received an academic book explaining the Christian theological and biblical interpretation of black power. Cone wrote the second book on liberation theology in 1970. Another black American scholar, J.D. Otis Roberts, wrote the third book on liberation theology at the beginning of 1971. With the start of a black theology of liberation, we could discern certain realities. First, black theology of liberation began in the United States not from academics, professors, or institutions of higher learning. It was created by black pastors and church administrators. Cone did not join this gathering until 3 years later. In fact, black theology of liberation might be the only theology in the United States that did not begin with people with PhD degrees. It might be the only indigenous USA theology that emerged out of the church and not the academy. Second, black theology of liberation was born in response to the struggles of black workers, rural peasants, and the poor. Like all liberation theologies across the world, this theology of liberation emerged from the bottom up. Third, black theology of liberation was started by pastors trying to figure out their vocation from God in the midst of ordinary people seeking to become full human beings. This theology saw itself making Christian believers accountable to the teachings of Jesus. And fourth and finally, black theology of liberation began with the Bible. The question was, how can the Bible tell humans what to believe and do? So first, an understanding of the Bible, and then its application to the human condition. Restated, black theology of liberation means starting with the liberation message of Jesus and discerning how that liberation is revealed in theology and in black American experiences. In the phrase black theology of liberation, the leading factor, the word that defines the rest of the phrase, the word that adjudicates the other two words, and the word that asks, have we been faithful to our calling? The main word in the phrase is the Jesus story of liberation. And so black theology of liberation begins with the Jesus parables about liberation that anchors what it means to be human. Without first clarifying the Jesus stories, our understanding of black and theology, the other two words of the phrase black theology of liberation, are stunted. Several Jesus stories give substance to Jesus' sense of his own vocation and how he defined the vocation for all humankind. First was a classic text of Luke chapter 4, verses 16 to 21. One can argue that this is the only place where Jesus offers us his self-understanding of why he is on earth. Indeed, this is his first public presentation. In a sense, it is the proclamation of why he walks and talks on earth. It is the first word of God's own self-understanding. It is the inaugural state of the cosmos speech. And we're familiar with this. It says, quote, he went to Nazareth where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue as it was his custom. He stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because it has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. It has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Close quote. So we must remember that the year of the Lord's favor refers to the book of Leviticus chapter 25, a period of God's favor and blessing of the poor and the oppressed. Furthermore, the phrase is associated with the year of Jubilee, denoting a period of debt forgiveness, land restitution, and freedom from physical slavery. The thread here is liberation of working people, the poor and those oppressed, and the remedy is freedom from debt, the end of physical slavery, and the return of land to people. Land restitution brings access to air and locally water. Land, air, and water, and all things derived from them, they constitute wealth. Similarly, the word theology in Black theology liberation points to the tradition of how Jesus' message of agency through liberation appeared in Black churches and all of church tradition. Martin Luther King Jr. and the 1950s and 1960s Black church movement are exemplars. In each of King's campaigns, he was using Black churches to lead Black and white communities to help provide better resources for Black families. Change of material resources is one way to achieve human dignity. For example, in the 1950s Montgomery bus boycott, the goal was for better access to bus seating for Black people to go to work and school and shopping. And that same movement also demanded jobs for Black bus drivers. And at the end of his life, King continued this theme of Black Americans using their agency to own material resources to improve their lives on earth, even as Dr. King believed in the ultimate end of heaven. For instance, on the night of April 3rd, 1968, which was his last sermon before he was assassinated the next year, April 4th, King said this in this excerpt at a Pentecostal church in Memphis. He said, quote, "And that's all this whole thing is about. We aren't engaged in any negative protests and in any negative arguments with anybody. We are saying that we are determined to be men. We are saying we are determined to be people. We are saying that we are God's children, and that we as God's children, we don't have to live like we are forced to live. We don't have to argue with anybody. We don't have to curse and go around acting bad with our words. We don't need any bricks and bottles. But deposit your money in a Black-owned bank. Go by the Black-owned Savings and Loan Association. Put your money there. You have 6 or 7 Black insurance companies here in the city of Memphis. Now we begin the process of building an economic base for our community." The final speech this excerpt of the final speech shows us one of the ways that Dr. King interpreted Jesus' proclamation as liberation. In addition to the words liberation and theology in the phrase Black theology liberation, there is also the word Black. Black refers to the experiences of Black American people during slavery, and especially in the 1960s Black Power movement. As we mentioned earlier, during the 1960s, the youth wing SNCC moved from civil rights to Black Power. This conclusion was the result of being localized in local communities, organizing day-to-day and living with people. And so the original definition of Black Power that Carmichael enunciated on June 16, 1966, had 2 parts to it. One, poor and working class people in the South, Black Belt South, should own the land. Second part of the definition is wherever there's a majority of poor and working class Black people in the rural South, they should occupy with majority of political power. Today, there are all kinds of definitions of Black and Black Power, but if we go back to the archives and the speeches, those were the 2 prominent aspects of what Black Power and what it meant to be Black during that period. And as previously stated, James H. Cone was the first to write a book on liberation theology and related to the Black experience in the United States. Cone read the Old Testament as a story about God delivering Jews from material slavery in Egypt into a freedom land where they owned their own earth, air, and water. And Cone saw the Jesus parables as a continuation of that liberation story. Indeed, Jesus was a Jew for Cone who revealed his purpose on earth to liberate working people and the poor into that ultimate freedom of heaven. And this faith and practice had universal implications for all working people. So out of the particularity of Black liberation theology that Cone enunciated, he offered a gift to the universal humankind. However, at the start of Black theology liberation in the 1960s and early 1970s, there were multiple theological voices and sharp debates about the definition of what is Black theology of liberation. We know of James Hal Cone, but there are many others who are sharply engaged around issues. For my dissertation, I interviewed 12 Black liberation theologians from 1966 of NCNCs up to Cone. And it was such a rich debate, which I think, at least on our side of the pond, we need to engage in. So we always think of Cone fighting white supremacy, which he did, but it was a rich debate with his Society for the Study of Black Religion, SSBR, which was founded in 1970 by Shelby Brooks, and the current president of SSBR is with us today, Raymond Carr. So the point is to talk about what marked the beginning of Black Liberation Theology USA was this huge debate amongst people. And there were theological debates, rich theological debates. For example, one colleague critiqued Cone for not linking liberation with Jesus' offer of reconciliation. If you're going to use Christology, then we also have to talk about theological healing. Another colleague of Cone asserted that Cone was not really constructing a Black theology of liberation if he did not use sources from the Black American experience. How can it be Black if it's not based on Black American experiences? And this is a question of theological method, theological healing, theological method. The third argued that Cone had not escaped the grip of white theology because his Black theology was still imprisoned by the linguistic and thought structures of the very oppressive theology that Cone critiqued. Here, offering a theological linguistic critique. Another debated Cone over the centrality of African culture and traditional religions in the making of a Black American theology. Here, the question of theological primal origins. Those of his peers more rooted in the church pointed out how Cone had not taken seriously the key moment in Black worship, which is the sermon. If you've ever been to Black Church in the United States, the hallelujah moment is going to be that sermon. So here is a critique of theological homiletics. And the ethicists of his generation questioned the legitimacy of his theology, lacking Black ethics, thus theological ethics. And then targeting the very jugular vein of Black theology. A Black philosopher asked Cone, how can Cone propose liberation without first analyzing the suffering that caused the need for liberation anyway? Here we have theological theodicy. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. A huge debate. And we must not forget, this is intra-debates, rich debates, and primarily through the Society for Ray Carr's, Regent, he'll be introduced, but he's the current president. This was through SSBR. Major part, somebody needs to write about that debate. And so when we look at Black theology and liberation in the United States, we note its historical tradition of engaging various theological themes. Thus, it is not a recent theological development. Rather, it forged various aspects of what one might call a theological movement among diverse generations. The first feature of this enduring movement underscores the rich and sharp intra- and intergenerational debate initiated by the first generation. Indeed, the longevity of Black theology liberation is characterized by the notion of generations, whose point of origin is July 31st, or the 31st of July in England, 1966. In a word, sharp internal theological debates among Black scholars themselves across generations are foundational to the origin of a Black theology of liberation. Second, Black theology of liberation relies on foundational theological sources such as the Bible, West African history, church history, Black history, contemporary experiences, and philosophical debates. Third, Black theology liberation in the United States has an institutional representation. Intergenerational theological debates, Black sources, theological sources, and thirdly, institutional representation. In 1966, the 48 pastors who published that Black Power statement in the New York Times, they created the National Committee of Negro Churchmen and subsequently changed the name. This was the first contemporary institutional representation of Black liberation theology. In 1970, as we mentioned, then the Society of Study of Black Religion was created, SSBR. Starting in 1971, some local Black churches began to practice Black theology liberation.
Recording in progress.
Some local Black churches began to practice Black theology liberation. I don't know if you heard of Trinity United Church of Christ, which was a big hoopla when Obama ran. They actually set up Black liberation theology in 1970. And then they hired Jeremiah Wright in 1971 to put it into practice. He didn't bring it here. The local people brought Black theology here. So another institutional representation is local Black churches. Throughout the 1970s, Black pastors and church administrators who built caucuses in predominantly white denominations throughout the United States. In 1975, we witnessed the rise of the Black Theology Project as a subset of the Theology in America organization. In 1976, in Tanzania, the first meeting of the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, which eventually brought in Black liberation theology. Also throughout the 1980s, proliferation in divinity schools, theological schools, and seminaries. These things called Black Church Studies programs were just everywhere during that period. In 1989, the Black Theology Unit of the American Academy of Religion was formed. Some of us were part of that, forming of that. And then in 2003, the famous Samuel DeWitt Proctor organization was born to apply the social justice theology of Black theology liberation to a network of Black American churches. And that's a vibrant, they do the Congress, it's amazing what they do. They're based in Chicago now. And then in January 2006, the International Association of Black Religions and Spiritualities, which we both were a part of, with Dr. Reddy and I, was created and included Black theology liberation. And finally, the only academic journal in the world focused on Black theology is Black Theology and International Journal, whose founder and editor-in-chief is our own, I'm appropriating you, from Oxford, our own Professor Anthony Reddy. Fourth is the ongoing relationship between Black theology liberation and its international theological networks. And there are a host of them for time reasons, I won't go into it, but the fourth mark is international relationships and theological networks in Black theology. Fifth, Black theology liberation has intentional audiences, very intentional, and hence diverse interlocutors. It makes conscious decisions to reflect critically on the nature of the faith of Black American churches, of the Black religious organizations, and gatherings of any individuals. And it consciously seeks theological and interdisciplinary projects throughout the global academic diaspora. Six, Black theology liberation has blossomed in all theological disciplines. An entire body of literature has been published in journals, and magazines, and books. Subject matter crosses all standard disciplines of religious education, as well as novel intellectual enterprises. And at least on our side of the pond, the most prolific are the women scholars, of which we have a leader in our room. I don't have my glasses on. She is the leader of the third wave, I suppose. Yeah. So we have chair of the SSBR, leader of the entire third wave in the US here. So we're in good hands. Seventh and finally, Black theology liberation offers its thought as part of the conversation with all human bodies of knowledge, domestic and beyond. Though Black theology liberation arises out of the particularity of the Black American experience, it understands that bodies of thought and practice are gifted from all humankind, from all periods of human history, including insights from how Jesus interacted with nature and the animal kingdom, which needs to be developed in Black liberation theology. The particularity might be Black experiences, yet the universal note is sounded by the Jesus stories, trumpeting the working people and the poor. As the majority populations, it is through their liberation and practice of freedom. One offers this promised gift of liberation, freedom for all humanity. Essentially, a Black theology of liberation grapples deeply with the human questions of today. When all human beings, thirsting for a new way to be fully human, face these questions and answers and discover that they are addressed with heart and head, they have the opportunity to open themselves to the reality of humane and just loving with all racial groups within the United States. It is in our mutual humanity, based on commitment to the freedom of working people and the poor, that we all thirst for some safe and comforting space where we and our families can open ourselves to intellectual questions and our existential feelings. In addition, a Black theology liberation reminds everyone continually of the necessity of experiencing a passionate love for people, especially those without voices. To love another is to recognize oneself in the face and life of another. To love someone is to immerse and expose oneself in the context and conversation and culture of another. Love is the ultimate risk of faith, grounded in the liberation of all humanity, of faith with a vision for a new heaven and a new earth where each person can achieve the fullest realization of her or his calling as it serves their families and their greater collective human, natural, and cosmological whole. To have such a love is to have a hope that springs from living in a balance and harmony found within the human being and in relationship to all that there is and has been. Faith, hope, and love make up a Black theology liberation. But more than that, they are what continue to keep poor and marginalized people alive and seeking a better life for themselves and future generations. Black theology liberation attempts to make intellectual sense of all this to help bring about a healthy human community for the working poor, and indeed, through them, for all the world's humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few moments before we go to our next speaker. Are there any questions anyone would like to ask? I should say questions are not homilies or mini sermons. I know that's right. There are a few preachers in the room. Any questions of Dwight?
Thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
And good to see you again. Because we met at King's last year.
Indeed.
Yeah. So I was wondering about J.D. Roberts, J.D. Otis, and I was wondering about how his theology is perceived today in comparison to Cohn's.
Yeah, I think Dr. Carr is president of SSBR, and Dr. White, who's leading third wave generation, could speak more to it, but my sense is that he may become more favorable as he's like, I don't know much, I'm drinking Baptist, so it's like, as wine ages. You know, I think Cohn in this moment, particularly in our country, the liberation and justice thing is warm and hot, but also I think that from my neighborhood, particularly Chicago, where many scholars or theologians are linked to churches who bring both the liberation piece and the reconciliation because of the church connection. So just as broad remarks. Also, I was part of a Womanist and Black Theology series at Paul Gray, and there are books coming out that also talk more about liberation. So from, I think, theologians of our generation who are linked to more churches to kind of be more open to liberation and justice and freedom being linked together. And as my small little data with the publishing the series, I saw more liberation and justice being, and reconciliation being linked together. Yeah.
Maybe one more question?
Thank you. Really fantastic, kind of pithy summary. It's just really a kind of very mundane question, but about the genealogy you started with MLK. How would you kind of narrate the prehistory, as it were, like the kind of body of work and writings have both come prior to the 60s, and where would you, how would you kind of, what story would you tell about the bridge between 18th, 19th century writings and then and work in the church for liberation and abolition, and how that feeds into the story you told?
Yeah, I think you can do it in two ways. One, you can do it around the theological themes of liberation and reconciliation, or liberation and precisely theological reconciliation. You see that those way how people relate to fighting against slavery and otherwise. The liberation part, you had those militant impulses from people like David Walker and Nat Turner and people like that, Denmark, BC. And then you also had others who fought for either colonialism to Liberia or staying within the country and fighting for their freedom within the system, or against the system of slavery, but for capitalism and democracy. But also in the political realm, you can see the same type of thing. Often we sort of schematically lay it out. It's much more complicated between, like W. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. So there are parallels within the theological / church movement and also within the so-called secular social movement like that. My view is both and, that, for those of us who involve churches and also community development work, from that angle, that small angle for me, is, people are involved in both, right? On the one hand, one has to have these, like Dolores Williams book, you gotta survive. And quiet as is kept, she does not deny liberation. But one has to survive, and while one is surviving, that sustains one toward liberation. But I think schematically it's often seen that there's a Du Bois side, there's a Booker T. Washington side, and there's this really militant liberationists, black liberationists such as David Walker, etc. And then there's sort of commendations churches, but I think it's much more complicated than that. So, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
The International Colloquium Series, confronting global issues with moral clarity and intellectual depth.